Welcome, everybody, to the Harvard Bridges School of Labor, presented by Labor United Educational League. Our purpose is to educate the workers of America on the strength of unions and to foster a class-conscious workforce. We aim to connect the struggles of the past with the struggles of today, to empower the labor movement to transform from their present hopeless defensive fight into an aggressive attack upon capital. We plan to empower workers with knowledge regardless of industry or type of work, bringing all workers to a class-oriented trade union movement. Of course, tonight's class is on the Plumb Plan, which is a follow-up from our class last month, where we had Adam, the national organizer for Public Rail Now, on to talk about the Public Rail Now campaign. And of course, that campaign is modeled off the Plumb Plan. So this is going to help us understand it a little bit better. What we'll be learning tonight, first, we're going to go into working conditions on the railroads in the 19 teens, leading up to World War One, and the nationalization of the railroads during World War One. Then we're going to get into details on the Plumb Plan, and then we're going to talk about the Plumb Plan and independent political action.
Yeah, Section 1, Working Conditions on the Railroads. The railroad spirit. Industrial workers as a whole react the same towards the basic problems that confront them in industry, yet they have considerable minor differences in psychology. The outlook of a needle worker is not like that of a steel worker, working in a huge plant amidst roaring machinery and elementary industrial processes and dominated by a powerful and ruthless trust. And sailors, homeless and wandering over the face of the earth, have a considerably different point of view than packing house workers who work in crowds in the midst of blood and mass death. The railroad worker, also, especially in the running trades, has his own special psychology. His sense of control over the long trains, his feeling that he occupies a strategic position in industry, his meeting with many new scenes and people daily, his relative freedom on the road from the spying presence of the boss, his realization that he is a member of a strong labor union, all combine to give him a sense of sturdy independence. Despite efforts of the companies and conservative leaders to check it, he shows this spirit constantly in his daily life, and he has written many glorious pages in labor history. In the historic strike of 1877, the American Railway Union strike of 1894, the outlaw switchman strike of 1919, the National Shopman strike of 1922, etc. In the 10 years that I spent as a railroader, I got to know well and to admire the militant spirit of the railroad workers. Let me illustrate it by a simple story, the tale of a piece of apple pie, which at the time it happened tickled my sense of humor and class spirit. I was working west out of Chicago as a brakeman on Northwestern. We were held at a small place with a meat order, and while waiting for the train that had to pass us, we all went into the lone local restaurant to grab a bite to eat. In the crew, there were 5 of us: the hoghead, engineer, the con, or conductor, excuse me, the tailpot, or fireman, and 2 shacks, or the brakemen. We also had along with us the division superintendent, an officious bureaucrat. The 6 of us sat down together. For dessert, we had some particularly appetizing-looking apple pie.
The one pie was cut in 5 pieces, and on top sat an extra piece for the 6th man. As the waitress put the luscious pie on the table, she remarked, "I was lucky to find the 6th piece. It's the last we got." As we ate, we workers chatted amongst ourselves, the super eating without a word. He gobbled his food and was the first to reach the dessert stage. Whereupon he shoved his knife under the double-decked section of the pie, put the 2 pieces on his plate, and began to wolf them. I was amazed at this proceeding, and so were the rest of the crew. What unspeakable gall! When the super took the 2 pieces of pie, he knew quite well that one of us would have to go pieless. I thought to myself, what a boss hog! What a true representative of the Northwestern Railroad Company. In fact, of all the employing class. The workers looked from one to another in rising contempt and anger. Finally, Slim, our boomer, hind-end brakeman, solved the situation in the traditional railroad worker's aggressive spirit. Quite unabashed by the super's reputation as a bureaucratic tyrant, Slim called out to the waitress, "Say, sister, bring us 5 portions of tapioca pudding. There's only enough pie here for the super." All us workers laughed loudly. The super's face turned red, and he left the table without finishing his pie. He also found some excuse for not traveling farther on our train. Within a couple of days, the whole division was laughing over the incident. It was surprising how much class feeling could be evoked by just a piece of apple pie. The interchange car inspector. For 10 years, in various capacities, I worked as a railroader. I liked the work, but found it dangerous. Once, when a fireman on the OR&N Railroad in Portland, Oregon, an explosion on an oil burner locomotive seriously burned my face and might have destroyed my eyes. Another time, I was nearly killed on the same road by a hostler starting a locomotive while I was underneath it. And again, I narrowly escaped gangrene from an injury received as a brakeman on the Chicago and Northwestern. I was laid up for 4 months and lost my job. But my worst experience came at car inspecting. When one railroad transfers cars to another, the receiving road has to make a close inspection of the cars as it accepts them. This is for self-protection, because the various railroads constantly seek to rob each other by smuggling through cars, needing heavy repairs, with missing parts, or carrying wrong equipment. The men who do this inspection are called interchange car inspectors. It was my lot to work at this job for several years up to 1917, on a number of roads, mostly in the Chicago switching district. The inspector had to be familiar with the innumerable parts of the hundreds of types of wooden freight cars in use upon scores of railroads. Besides, he had to know the equipment all these cars were supposed to carry, and he had to work so rapidly that he had to gauge at a glance the condition of the cars. If he made a mistake by failing to note that a car was carrying the wrong kind of wheels, air brake, or coupler, or that a pair of sills were broken, it cost his company considerable money and brought consequence hell down on himself. The car inspector received from $75 to $80 a month. For this wage, he slaved 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. As for myself, with the job an hour's streetcar ride distant, it used to be 14 hours from the time I left home for work until I got back. There were no vacations, and one had to put in as sick to get even a day's layoff. The car inspector's life was an eternal round of work and sleep, with no opportunity for education or relaxation. In all kinds of weather, the car inspectors could be found plugging along the trains, giving them a swift once over. Even on the colder nights, we used to work without gloves, with record books in one hand and pencil in the other. But far worse than the overwork and inclement weather was the great eye strain produced by the constant rapid glancing over the cars under all kinds of light condition. Many an inspector ruined his eyes in this way. It so happened that for me, this eye strain proved disastrous. Piecework is the bane of the working class. It means the most destructive speed up and exploitation. The workers in the railroad industry, especially in the car works and locomotive repair shops, suffered greatly from this evil up to the time of the World War, when the unions succeeded largely in abolishing it. In the several pre-war years that I worked in the railroad car department as a car inspector, car carpenter, air brakeman, and laborer on various railroads, I had much experience with piecework. It was particularly vicious in the numerous car shops in the Chicago district, and was so general that even laborers who gathered up the scrap lumber and iron were paid on the piece basis. Repairing the wooden railroad cars of those days was very heavy work, but when paid by the piece, it was simply man-killing. In my time, I have done much hard labor, but none so exhausting as piecework car repairing. The workday was 10 hours and the pace grueling. The workers were mostly Poles, Lithuanians, and other Slavs, a husky bunch indeed. Americans, English, and Irish were as scarce as hen's teeth at this hard and ill paid work. The car repairers worked at a speed that literally burned them up, but few could earn over $15 to $20 a week. An ordinary worker would starve at the job, and the average work life of the powerful immigrant piecework car repairers did not exceed 10 years. Straight piecework was bad enough, but when bonus systems were injected into it, then it became real hell. Take, for example, the time bonus system in the car shops and on the RIP tracks of the C and EI Railroad. The immigrant workers looked upon this as an invention of the devil. Besides driving them to the limit of endurance, it was so complicated that none could understand it. Two elements, the basic piece price and the time it took to do the work, entered into the final calculation of what a worker was paid for a given job. As an illustration, replacing a few boards on a car had a basic rate of, say, 20 cents, with a time allowance of 20 minutes. Thus, if you finished the job in 20 minutes, you got 20 cents for it. Simple enough so far. But if it took 25 minutes, you only got 18 cents, or if you could conclude the job within 15 minutes, you would get 22 cents. This complicated system created confusion, worse confounded. No worker knew how much he was earning, for there were hundreds of parts and combination of parts in the old wooden cars, and only the timekeeper knew the exact time consumed and the ultimate piece price arrived at on each operation. The general result was that the men speeded themselves desperately. They had no protection against being robbed shamelessly by the company lick-spittle piecework checkers. On payday, the men, almost entirely unorganized, took whatever was handed to them, helpless to make a recheck of their many piece jobs of the previous 2 weeks. Small wonder that the railroad companies defended the piecework plan as the apple of their eye, and that the railroad unions made it the center of their attack. Piecework car repairing not only destroyed the workers by excessive toil, it also brought them terrible injuries and sudden death. The following was an all too common occurrence. Mike Kovics was a truck hand at Swift's refrigerator car shops in the Chicago stockyards, where I worked as an air brake repairman. Now, even at regular rates, work on car trucks, the wheels and the heavy steel framework about them is very hard and dangerous work. But when it is done on a piece basis, it is truly murderous. On Swift's repair track, the company had formerly had a special crew of day work men to jack up the cars so that the piecework truck hands could work under them. This gave the latter a measure of protection, for the jacking up of the cars was done by experts. But the company, for the economy's sake, abolished the jacking crew and threw upon the pieceworking truck hands the task of jacking up their own cars. This change meant, as the company well understood, exposing the truck hands to terrible danger. For in the usual rush of piecework, they could not use the necessary care in jacking up the heavy cars. Soon the inevitable accident happened. Mike and his partner had hurriedly jacked up a heavily loaded refrigerator car, but in their haste, they failed to properly place the blocking for the jack, setting it on too soft ground. They got the car raised, but hardly had Mike crawled under it than the treacherous blocking collapsed and the loaded car fell full upon him. His body was crushed flat, almost in two, between the car sills and the wheel, and he died instantly without uttering a sound. I saw the whole tragedy from where I was working nearby. Mike was just another of the nameless thousands of workers slaughtered yearly for profit's sake. After the death of Mike, Swift and Company, with cynical hypocrisy, put up many snappy "safety first" signs, but they refused to give the truck hands back their jacking crew. The deadly menace of piece car work repairing extended beyond the car department. It was also a threat to life and limb of the train service workers and to the traveling public. I saw this tragically illustrated one night in the killing of a young switchman in the Wood Street, Chicago, yards of the C and N.W. Railroad, where I was employed as a car inspector. Near our car, shanty a switching crew were breaking up a cut of cars. They uncoupled a big steel hopper car loaded with 50 tons of coal and gave it a swift kick down the track. A switchman leaped. They were overspeeded also to break down the hopper before it should crash into a string of boxcars further along. Clambering hasty up the head end side ladder, he grabbed the hand wheel to screw up the brakes. The hand wheel, on top of the brake staff, is supposed to be kept in place by a single nut. But this car had just come from the piecework repair track. In the hurry of the work, the all-important brake nut had not been properly tightened. So, when the switchman grabbed the hand wheel and threw his weight with a twisting grasp to put on the brakes, the hand wheel came loose. With a wild shriek, the switchman pitched forward between the wheels of the heavy car. Both trucks passed over him. His head was completely cut off. His body was carried home to his widow and 3 young children, who were left to meet life without a breadwinner and practically penniless. But the juggernaut of the railroad piecework system went on, undisturbed by this proletarian tragedy and hundreds of others like it.
There can be no question as to the authority of railroad officials under government control to perform all of their usual duties, and there has been no lack of support from the railroad administration when these duties were properly and diligently performed. This is a quote from a review of the work of a government body that once existed to ensure national rail service flowed throughout the nation. You may be surprised to find out that this quote and the relevant agency is from the United States. The United States Railroad Administration, the USRA, existed from 1916 to 1920 and came into existence at a time where the private rail industry was clearly not working for the betterment of the state at war. While the United States entered the First World War late, they had agreed to supply many European allies with munitions, arms, and other such war material necessary to fight against the enemy. By 1915 alone, the United States rail network was over 260,000 miles or 420 kilometers in length. Around 1/6 of all trackage was in default. There were over 400 railway companies operating across the nation, and they fought not just against each other for market dominance, but also against the very state itself, which tried to set measures in line with the war effort. Around the same time, unions representing various workers on the railroads were fighting for an 8-hour working day and better working conditions. Their working conditions were judged by the Commission on Industrial Relations. This 9-member commission was launched to investigate working conditions not just in the industrial sector, but also in American agricultural practices. The commission was led by a labor lawyer from Kentucky and sought to find not just the cause, but also the cure for industrial violence in the United States. Why were people doing such violent acts? Well, among the findings of the commission, they found, quote, "We hold that efforts to stay the organization of labor or to restrict the right of employees to organize should not be tolerated, but that the opposite policy should prevail, and the organization of the trade unions and of the employees' associations should be promoted. This country is no longer a field for slavery, and where men and women are compelled, in order that they may live, to work under conditions in determining which they have no voice, they are not far removed from the conditions existing under feudalism or slavery." With the passage of the Adamson Act in 1916, railroad workers were provided an 8-hour working day. Yet, it took a fight in the United States Supreme Court for insurance that the railroad companies would comply with the legislation. The disorganization of private rail would remain a factor for several months and delay the shipment of European arms, passenger transit, and fracture the economy. With Proclamation 1419 delivered by President Woodrow Wilson and intended to go into effect in late 1917, the railroads and most other transport infrastructure would come under not just state supervision, but direct control from the central government and armed forces. This was necessary for the security of the nation and commerce. Passenger rail services would indeed continue, and it was to a degree where the state produced several travel posters, advertisements for the California Rail Service and other localities. Rail transport went from an industry with over 400 companies to a single, well-respected and well-funded government agency. The United States Railroad Administration ensured that electric rail was maintained and expanded. The administration established standards which would last well beyond the life of its work. The USRA also set about to ensure that empty boxcars languishing in rail yards would be put to use hauling wheat, mail, and passengers between rural areas of the nation. That was not something seen as profitable by private enterprise, but certainly is important for national interests, whether at war or in peacetime. The administration also instituted pay raises for workers at all levels. A rail worker who may have earned $40 each month would see a raise of $20, while a locomotive engineer who earned $200 may see a raise of $45 each month. This was an experiment that did not have to end the way it did, and yet railroad firms after the war were able to not only gain access to the boxcars and trains, they also were able to get back the physical infrastructure through court. The railroad firms, as I understood it, would sue the federal government multiple times for hundreds of millions of dollars, claiming that the state authority entrusted to manage railroad infrastructure conducted property damage. This is a history Americans rarely hear about. Instead, Americans are typically inundated with doomerism and the failures of statecraft. Conrail, a later attempt at nationalization, was deliberately constructed to fail. This earlier institution, however, was perfectly capable of continuing its work had it been given the ability to do so. I hope that you liked today's presentation. If you did, I encourage you to leave a comment or like the video, share it around to those you think may be interested. If you like the topics I cover on this channel, please feel free to subscribe for more. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for taking the time.
And with that, we'll break for our first round of questions and comments. First, I want to add that the reading from the first section was a first-hand account of the working conditions on the railroad from none other than William Z. Foster in his autobiography, Pages from a Worker's Life.
Yeah, so I saw that video mentioned Conrail. Michael Parenti in one of his lectures had a thing about that where it was indeed a failing rail service, and basically the government had bought them out because they were so much in the red, and then they had turned it into a profitable and not-for-profit public service that was one of the best in the nations on the Northeast Corridor. And Ronald Reagan ended up selling it $2 billion under its actual value to private interests, who once again then ran it into the ground to seek profit, as they do, because we can't have a working public infrastructure.
That I have to finish that book because that is fascinating. It sounds like the railroads today in a lot of ways. Like we mentioned, the sign said safety first. That is brought up a lot in this industry still. The interchange, that I think is still very much appropriate for today, where it's essentially one railroad trying to screw over another railroad for their benefit. That can work with trackage rights, which is favoring their own traffic over other railroads. And I think the only thing that was different, and maybe it was, if I got that right, there were like 6 people on that crew or something like that, where today it's much less, it's like 2. But you could see how things have changed. Definitely. I do have a question. That looked a little, dare I say, Bolshevik. Some of that, like that picture where the people were marching, and what we know what was happening at this time. Well, there was a Bolshevik revolution in Russia. So how did that influence the decision of the Plum Plan, or the nationalization of the railroad? That's
I don't think it had, well, the decision to nationalize the railroad, the decision came in 1916, so I don't think it had much of an effect at all. Um, the main cause of, the private companies couldn't produce service the way it was needed for, munitions to be shipped. So it was really a wartime move, and that's where the Plan came into effect, democratize it and make it a permanent infrastructure change.
and real quick, the other thing that's impressed me was using the hoppers to actually do something useful rather than just sit there. Because you could think a company doesn't care what the other parts of the nation are doing with their hoppers. But if you nationalize it, you can actually have a better use for all of the resources. That's all.
That's also what led to the creation of Amtrak. Now, this had more so to do with the passenger rail. Same deal, failing railroads. As of yet, I don't think we have yet to re-privatize it. That has a lot of problems. It has less the way that American railroads work is that your passenger services have priority over freight, and the intention there was kind of like the sunset, like this program over time. Let it go out. Some quote unquote wins, and I quote, that the old administration tried to sell as part of the infrastructure packages.
And with that, if we have no more questions or comments, we'll go to our next section.
Section 2, the Plumb Plan. The Plumb Plan itself. Authored by Glenn E. Plumb, born in 1866 and died on August 1st, 1922. In 1917, he was appointed as counsel for railroad workers' organizations. When the U.S. government took public ownership of the rails in 1917, following the joining of World War I, the Plumb Plan was an effort to make that arrangement permanent. The plan was backed by workers and endorsed at the United Mine Workers Convention in 1919 and the 1920 American Federation of Labor Convention. It was opposed by the railroad executives, Samuel Gompers, and members of Congress. Some who supported the plan were labeled Plumb Plan agitators and watched by the FBI. The ABC of the Plumb Plan. What is the Plumb Plan? It is a plan for the public ownership and the democracy in the control of the railroads. Who has endorsed it? The 2 million organized railroad employees of America and the American Federation of Labor, approving the principle of government ownership, has instructed its executive committee to cooperate with the officers of the railroad internationals in their effort. It also has been endorsed by several farmers' organizations. How does it propose to buy the roads? By issuing government bonds with which to pay for the legitimate private interests in the railroad industries. How does it propose to operate the roads? By a board of 15 directors, 5 named by the president to represent the public, 5 elected by the operating officers, 5 elected by the classified employees. Does this mean government operation? No. It is operation by a board in which those having the responsibility also have the authority. It is superior to government operation because it prevents control by an inefficient bureaucracy and is true democracy since it gives the men engaged in the industry a voice in its management. What becomes of the surplus? After operating expenses are paid and fixed charges are met, including the interest on outstanding government securities. The surplus is divided equally between the government and the men. The employees' portion is to be divided between the managerial and classified employees, the former receiving double the rate received by the latter class. This is not a profit, since the corporation has no capital. What the men receive is a dividend on efficiency. Is this a bonus system? No. It is giving those who increase production a share of the results of their increased effort has produced. And this share is theirs for as long as they are actually in the service and is not forfeitable. Why do operating officials receive the larger rate of dividend? Because it serves as a greater stimulus to the group with the most responsibility. And since the operating officials would lose dividends if wages were increased, it acts automatically to prevent collusion between labor directors and the operating directors to outvote the public directors in raising wages beyond a reasonable level. The chief argument against the plan is that the public loses control of its own property and that the men in charge cannot be prevented from combining to pay themselves extortionate wages. This method of sharing dividends sets up a natural barrier against collusion. Public and labor share and share alike. The Plumb Plan League has been formed for the purpose of uniting in a single organization the millions of American citizens who believe that the time has come when the public must take over the railroads of the country. The organization is national in scope and nonpartisan in character. A financial panic is threatened by the demand of the railroad interests for the return of the railroads to private control on terms certain to result in disaster. The leading financiers of Wall Street and the most prominent railway executives declare that this crisis is coming, unless their wishes are complied with. Other equally competent authorities assert that the plans of the railroad interests are certain to result in disaster if the railroads are given back on their terms. Distinguished officials of our government, legislative, administrative, and executive, agree that this danger is impending, although they disagree on the best methods of averting it. Upon but one point, apparently, is there harmony of thought, and that is in the necessity for governmental intervention to save the nation from a financial panic a few years after the closing of the World War. Such a panic would be far more serious than was the Panic of 1873, which occurred within 10 years after the Civil War. Over 6 million American citizens and voters, through the Organized Railway Employees of America, composed of the 14 railroad internationals, together with the American Federation of Labor, the Nonpartisan League, various farmers' organizations, and civic bodies, support the Plumb Plan as the only rational solution of the railroad problem. The Plumb Plan League comes into existence, therefore, to arouse public sentiment and secure laws to accord with the determination of these millions of American citizens to make the principles of the Plumb Plan effective in the critical situation which confronts the country. Other millions of Americans, representing all walks of life, whose interests are likewise in danger, will be appealed to and urged to join this movement on behalf of the public welfare. The four corners of the Plumb Plan. Railroads are overcapitalized. Hence, freight and passenger rates are exorbitant, wages inadequate, and service unsatisfactory. Purchase the railroads for the actual amount invested to afford public service as determined judicially, recognizing no fictitious securities, no discounts, and no improvements paid for out of earnings or by the public. Substitute for the present Wall Street control, the unhampered management of trained officials and employees, the most intelligent and efficient transportation organization in the world. Pay capital a fair and fixed return on the dollars actually invested in railroad property, and divide savings affected by economy and efficiency between the public and the operating organization, share and share alike. Plain facts about railroad financing. The income received by railroad companies is derived chiefly from the transportation of commodities and people, freight charges, and passenger fares. Both of these are paid by the public. The expenditures of railroad companies include, broadly speaking, returns on securities issued, cost of upkeep and extensions, operating charges, and wages to employees. Rates, which include both freight and passenger fares, must provide the income necessary to cover expenditures. Otherwise, bankruptcy is inevitable. Therefore, the item of returns on securities issued, or which are included in the property investment account, is of paramount importance in rate fixing. This property investment account item is vital. It should be noted carefully. It is a bookkeeping term used to cover the billions of watered stock and billions of fictitious values upon which Wall Street demands that labor and the public shall pay tribute. Inflated capitalizations, if officially recognized by Congress, will call for inflated earnings. These can only be produced by higher rates or reduced wages and inferior service.
And with that, we'll break for our second round of questions and comments.
6 million railroad workers, it said. I think the number now is like a little over 1 million people work for the railroads. It could be even less. But yeah, that's just a drastic change. There's definitely more people living in the US today than there were in the 1910s and 20s. So just something to think about. That's all.
And keep in mind that was 6 million organized workers.
Yeah, so I was saying I definitely see a lot of overlap from back then to today's public rail now. I was looking at articles earlier on from the 20s on the Plumb Plan, and the capitalist press was, they were putting out hit pieces on the Plumb Plan, on Glenn Plumb, Warren Stone, I think, of the Brotherhood for Trainsmen, whatever it was. But you could tell that even something that wasn't meant to be super radical was, a big threat to the bosses.
I think the most surprising thing is to know that Gompers decided to side with this, considering everything else he did for the rest of his life.
At this time, when the Plum Plan first came out, the railroads were already nationalized, and this is almost viewed as a compromise between going back to the way things were and whatnot.
I just thought it was interesting how a lot of people oppose reforms or fighting for improvements in working people's conditions. But the ruling class fights this fiercely, and they expend a lot of resources fighting this, and they're not doing that for no reason. They're not doing that because, oh, whatever. It's because they know those are conditions that are going to push towards more unity.
We had a comment in the chat here, quick. I'm just gonna read it off. Sorry, I was way off. Number is 120,000 workers for Class 1 freight railroads in 2024. So probably much less than 1 million today if we include all railroad workers. That's just amazing how far. That's just amazing. I don't even have the words.
Yeah, so and I actually did section 2, and in doing research for that, some of the Plum Plan League organizers were actually targeted and watched by the FBI and were labeled as Plum Plan agitators while they were ostensively looking for Bolsheviks. So there was that. And funnily, you should mention Samuel Gompers. Around the time the Plum Plan League came out, He was actually palling it up with some big names in Europe, talking about Versailles and the post reconstruction of Europe. He flew back. Flew back. He went back to New Jersey at this point, met with Plum and asked him very curtly to please take my name off as honorary president of this plan. I do not think I should be associated with this because I think this will hurt workers' livelihoods, blah, 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 blah. So, a real work, that one.
Yeah, that sounds more like Samuel Gompers.
Yeah, notice there was a little logo. I'm gonna share it on the screen again since I could do that. But I was curious what we think of it. It said, "Three shall control these." It says labor, public, management, and then in the middle is Plum Plan League. What do we think of that?
It's a compromise.
It's a compromise. Well, where's the compromise? Management?
Management.
Yeah.
Yep.
Fair.
When if you remember last month when Adam was here from Public Rail Now, he shared a similar graphic that was put together for Public Rail Now, and in their version it was Labor Public Planet.
Oh, that's good. That's better.
Yes. And with that, if we have no more questions and comments, we're going to go to our final section.
Section 3, Plum Plan and Independent Political Action. The Plum Plan League. The Plum Plan League was a political organization of the railroad unions to push for the implementation of the Plum Plan. In this era of flourishing growth, organizationally, politically, and otherwise, the railroad unions became the progressive wing of the whole trade union movement. They enlivened and invigorated its entire structure. They menaced the control and policies of the reactionary AF of L machine. At the 1920 convention of the AF of L, the bloc of railroad unions gave Gompers the greatest defeat of his career, when in spite of the desperate opposition, they forced the endorsement of the Plum Plan. The railroad unions were infusing the whole labor movement with a new spirit of progress. The Plum Plan League. Quote, the masses of workers heading towards their first real break with capitalism wholeheartedly and enthusiastically endorsed the Plum Plan for the nationalization of the railroads. So strong was the sentiment that even the strongest and most reactionary of the railroad union leaders dared not oppose it. The railroad workers backed up their endorsement of the Plum Plan by establishing a definite political organization, the Plum Plan League. That's from William Z. Foster and the Watson Parker Law, the latest schemes to hamstring railroad unionism. The first step in this direction had to do with political measures. The unions clearly recognized their industrial relationships and mutual interdependence in the Plum Plan. To advocate this proposal, they formed themselves into the Plum Plan League, issued the joint journal, quote, labor, and launched a general publicity campaign. But it was not long until this new cooperation also manifested itself on the industrial field. And in 1920, all the organizations united in a national movement for wage increases. Thus, after many long years of evolution, the enormous army of railroad workers, beginning at the simple system of one trade acting at a time in each division town, finally arrived at the stage where all the trades acted together simultaneously on every railroad in the United States. Although the lineup was yet far from perfect, the 185,000 railroad men, for the first time in their history, were moving in a body against the common enemy. The approach made to industrial unionism by this long evolution is unmistakable. That's from William Z. Foster and Railroaders' Next Step and Amalgamation. This is Railroad Democracy. The Plum Plan published a weekly newsletter called Railroad Democracy. Railroad Democracy was published from 1919 to 1922. The Conference for Progressive Political Action, the CPPA. As Foster noted in his pamphlet, on the Railway Labor Act. The Plumb Plan League would develop into the Conference for Progressive Political Action. This organization, the CPPA, had the active support of fully 2.5 million organized workers and farmers, saturated with Labor Party sentiment, which was betrayed by the leaders, and with revolt against the two capitalist parties. The CPPA constituted the greatest mass effort ever made by the workers in this country for independent political action. The railroad workers were the heart and soul of the whole movement. The Conference for Progressive Political Action was officially established by the convention call of the 16 major railway labor unions in the United States, represented by a committee of 6: William H. Johnson of the Machinist Union, Martin F. Ryan of the Railway Carmen, Warren S. Stone of the Locomotive Engineers, E.J. Mannion of the Railroad Telegraphers, Timothy Healy of the Stationary Firemen, and L.E. Shepard of the Order of Railway Conductors. CPPA continued. The idea of joining the forces of every progressive, liberal, and radical organization of the workers must be mobilized to repel these assaults and to advance the industrial and political power of the working class. Originated with the National Executive Committee of the Socialist Party USA, which issued an appeal to unions and progressive political organizations for such a group in September 1921. The CPPA was originally intended to be an umbrella organization, uniting various elements of the farmer labor political movement around a common program for joint independent political action. In practice, however, invitations to the group's founding conference were issued to members of a wide variety of progressive organizations, including those who did not seek a new political organization. As a result, the body was quite heterogeneous and unable to agree on a program or even a declaration of principles at its initial gathering. Founding Conference. The first national conference of the CPPA was held in Chicago in February of 1922. It was attended by 124 delegates from a broad spectrum of labor, farmer, and political organizations, as well as a group of progressive individuals. The gathering passed an, quote, address to the American people, stating its criticism of existing conditions and formally proposing an amorphous plan of action validating the status quo ante. The labor unions on the group's right wing to endorse the labor-friendly candidates of the Democratic Party, the Socialist and Farmer Labor Party adherents on the group's left wing to conduct their own independent campaigns. The founding conference passed a, quote, plan of action consisting of 3 rather amorphous resolutions that served in lieu of a more formal constitution. The resolutions called for all labor, farmer, cooperative, and progressive political forces would unite to secure the nomination and election of members of Congress and to other state and local elective bodies, who were in agreement with the CPPA's support the interest of the producing classes. To this end, it urged the formation of joint committees within each state, congressional district, county, and municipality to decide upon the course of action. A general committee of 15 members, quote, as representative as possible of the various groups constituting this conference, was elected to serve as a coordinating body for a second conference of the organization. The CPPA dissolves. The Conference for Progressive Political Action lasted for 3 years and was stifled by factional infighting. Throughout its 3 years, different groups who agitated for an independent labor party would be either forced out or leave, viewing the CPPA as a dead end. At the CPPA convention in February 1925, L.E. Shepard, president of the Order of Railway Conductors, presented a resolution calling for a continuation of the CPPA on nonpartisan lines as a political pressure group. This proposal was met by an amendment by Morris Hillkit of the Socialist Party, who called the 5 million votes cast for La Follette an encouraging beginning and urged action for establishment of an American Labor Party on the British model, in which constituent groups retain their organizational autonomy within the larger umbrella organization. A third proposal was made by J.A.H. Hopkins of the Committee of 48, which called for establishment of a progressive party built around individual enrollments. No vote was ever taken by the convention on any of the three proposals mooted. Instead, after some debate, the convention was unanimously adjourned, Sindai, bringing an abrupt end to the Conference for Progressive Political Action. Supporters of an independent party reconvened a founding convention, which was split between adherents of a non-class progressive party based upon individual membership and support for a class-conscious Labor Party, employing direct affiliation of organizations of workers and farmers and of progressive political and educational groups who fully accept its program and principles. Following extensive debate, the socialist counterproposal was defeated by a vote of 93 to 64. The body voted to allow the chair to appoint an executive committee of 5 to coordinate with the local organizations and establishing a network of state groups. These state conventions were to elect delegates to a governing national committee. 2 delegates per state, 1 male and 1 female. This progressive party survived for a short time in a limited number of states. It held no national convention in 1925, but continued in independent existence throughout the 1920s.
And with that, we'll break for our last round of questions and comments. That last section there was a little bit condensed because I was worried we weren't going to have enough time to get through a lot of the CPPA history. But it's worth noting that during this final convention, founding convention of this so-called progressive party, by this point, most of the more left-wing elements of the CPPA had it just no longer there. Had they been there, that motion to pass an independent party of class conscious party probably would have passed. That's just at least my opinion, but
Okay, so trying to connect this to the Plumb Plan and I guess the dissolving of nationalized railroad, how did CPPA and it dissolving play an effect to that? I mean, here it just seems like, yeah, the CPPA was slowly just whittled down, but yeah.
well, the Plum Plan League was the first political movement for independent political action because of its role in pushing for the Plum Plan. Then as the Plum Plan kind of faded away and the railroad unions moved on to forming the CPPA to keep on keep on moving in the aim of progressive political action, independent political action. So one morphed into the other as one was no longer viable, and that's and it was the CPPA was ripe with factional infighting, as we see so often with left movements of any kind, and that was ultimately its downfall in the end, where the more conservative elements within it won out, and essentially, this was probably the beginning of labor connecting itself to the Democratic Party, although that wasn't really didn't go full force until late in the CIO days. We'll move to close out. And of course, the Harry Bridges School of Labor is presented by Labor United Educational League, and you can find us on various social media platforms. On Twitter at Lowell_US, on Instagram at Lowell.us, on Facebook at LaborUnited.Lowell, and on YouTube at Labor United. Of course, you can find Lowell on its website at www.lowell.us, and you can find our publication Labor Today at labortoday.lowell.us. And you can join us next month for the Harry Bridges School of Labor, and it'll be a class on Black lead rank and file movements. And that class will be on Wednesday, February 5th at 9 p.m. Eastern, repeated on Saturday, February 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern. And we're gonna go with a generic closeout song tonight, but it's a great one, of course. Solidarity Forever.
Solidarity